Yo, the reviews are in for Black Sunday at Timeline Theater. They're calling the new play a particularly poignant and poetic drama, spectacularly immersive, ooh, that's some praise, and a spellbinding 90 minutes of theater. That's why you don't want to miss the world premiere of this homegrown show, which tells a haunting story of climate change, migration, and family in the days leading up to one of the most infamous dust storms in 1930s Texas. Black Sunday runs through June 29th at Timeline Theater in Lakeview. For more info and tickets, head to timelinetheater.com. Today on CityCast Chicago, as summertime Chi slowly heats up, some neighborhoods will be hotter than others. And to be clear, I'm talking about literal temperature. And with those higher temps come bigger risks from extreme heat. Last year, we talked with Tribune reporter Sarah McAreg, who investigated and mapped these disparities. She told us what she found and explains what the city could do to protect all neighborhoods. It's Monday, June 3rd. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. Sarah, welcome to CityCast.
Thank you so much for having me.
No, thank you for being here. Right now, the weather's pretty mild. We're slowly dipping our toe into some summertime Chi, but we know heat waves are coming. Why is it important to know where the hottest spots in Chicago are?
Well, the differences, are not minimal. I would say that first of all. In doing my research for the story that we did, looking at land surface temperatures across all of Chicago, what we found ultimately were differences by as much as 24 degrees between the areas with the coolest average temperatures over the last decade and the areas with the hottest average temperatures over the last decade.
Right. And when I'm thinking of weather patterns, right, if it's about to snow, I know that certain parts of the Chicagoland area are going to get more snow. I know that certain parts of Illinois are more susceptible to tornadoes. Certain parts of the city are more susceptible to flooding. But when you say there's a difference of maybe 24 degrees, I guess my brain just doesn't really have the language to make sense of that. So on like the hottest day in the summer, are you saying one neighborhood can be at, 75 degrees and in another neighborhood they're peaking in 90, or is that like cumulatively across a summer?
No, that is the case on a single day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, after really digging into the data, I get nervous around citing, kind of specific numbers unless I absolutely know that they're the case. I don't know that we would always see that margin, but we do know that that pattern holds. Partly what we're looking at is not a natural phenomenon. There are decisions that have been made about the built environment in Chicago that have resulted in the fact that some neighborhoods are much more industrialized. What people intuitively know is that, of course, you don't walk barefoot on the sidewalk at the height of summer in Chicago. It's scorching. Imagine you're in a neighborhood where there's an industrial corridor nearby. That means a lot of warehouses. That means big, big rooftops. Sometimes they're black. They really absorb and radiate heat. You have much bigger swaths of asphalt. It's not just a matter of, certain neighborhoods having more industry. If they have more industry, that also implies what they have less of.
Exactly.
Less parks, less trees.
What are those kind of practical dangers of extreme heat? You say we don't walk on the sidewalk when it's super hot outside, but what are some of those other dangers of it just getting really scorching in our neighborhoods?
Well, everyone is susceptible. Everyone is potentially susceptible to heat stress. And heat stress is basically when our body becomes so hot that its ability to regulate itself goes off kilter. It can be mild. And it can also be serious to the point of being fatal. The researchers I spoke to talk about vulnerability, in a number of dimensions. People who don't have air conditioning, for instance.
Yeah. People with pre-existing medical conditions.
Exactly.
Yeah, as I was reading through your report, according to the National Weather Service, heat is the deadliest weather phenomenon, killing more people in an average year than hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and cold. We spend so much time talking about the dangers of all of these others, but when we start thinking about heat in the summer, I mean, obviously, so much of the conversation starts gearing around enjoyment, entertainment, being outside, that we start to overlook these real consequences. Where are the hottest places in Chicago, Sarah?
In general, you see a lot of overlap with, as I mentioned, places that are more industrialized. You know, there's a huge belt on the southwest side of areas that are among the hottest. And whenever we say hottest, what we mean is places that are hotter than 90% of the rest of Chicago. We see that a lot on the southwest side.
And I was going to say the southwest side, right? A largely Latino population, right? I'm thinking over by like the airport, ton of asphalt, like former industrial sites, rail yards. Where else?
In the Northwest, until I dug into this, I didn't realize that there was an industrial corridor on the Northwest side. And we certainly see a part of the Northwest side, not Northwest as in like all the way in the corner towards O'Hare, but, north of the West Side, there's just a pocket where there's a lot of heat. And then I will say, there's little parts, not necessarily giant swaths of clusters and clusters of block groups, but you certainly see outliers, for instance, on the southeast side. And that's it's really important to sort of sit with that information, because one of the things that, again, we intuitively know about weather in Chicago is that it's cooler by the lake.
Right. That's what I was thinking when you first said Southwest and Northwest, where I was like, well, I understand so many other factors, but I'm like, they're also far away from this ocean. Is that impacting the temperature, or is it not that simple?
A climatologist I talked to said certainly the lake is the terminology climatologists use is a climate forcing element. So it does certainly impact our local weather. But that climatologist also went on, and who's the Illinois state climatologist, also went on to break down what we see in hotter areas, than cooler areas, and the fact that it is the built environment. And so it is the case that if one looked at the map for 1 second, they could say, well, that's just further from the lake. But if you actually sit with it a bit longer than that, you see little neighborhoods, you see little clusters that are closer to the lake, that are hotter than places that are further from the lake. And you also see areas that are further inland that are cooler, than areas that are closer to the lake. So the pattern does not hold.
Yeah, one of the examples you all gave is, despite Chinatown being closer to the lake, it's typically hotter than a place like Logan Square. And if you go through those two neighborhoods, you start to realize, like you said, from the built environment, when you're looking closer to Chinatown towards that sort of South Loop corridor, you see former industry there, right? And if these large industrial sites were a park, for example, then we would likely see cooler temperatures in those areas.
Yeah, when you look at the map, parks, like many of the other interventions experts talk about, have, proven research behind them. There have been places, because what you can look at with satellite data is changes over time. So, for instance, if a park is introduced, that is how researchers have been able to study and understand that indeed temperatures come down. So if people really wanted to get into this at their community level, at their neighborhood level, for instance, there's a vacant lot, and perhaps that can be transformed. That's something that can be looked at over time.
At Evernorth Health Services, we believe costs shouldn't get in the way of life-changing care, and we're doing everything in our power to make it possible. Behavioral health solutions that also keep your projections at their best? It's possible. Pharmacy benefits that benefit your bottom line? It's possible. Complex specialty care that cares about your ROI? It's possible. Because we're already doing it. All while saving businesses billions. That's Wonder made possible. Learn more at evernorth.com/wonder.
Sarah, almost 30 years ago, Chicago experienced the heat wave of 1995 that killed upwards of, I believe, 700 people. If unaddressed, with the differences that climate change is bringing, if we don't address this, are we looking at more heat waves like the one in 1995?
Yeah, the way that a researcher I spoke to put it is that we will see more heat waves. She mentioned 1995, and I would also say that there have been heat waves since that have been deadly. Climate change is making heat waves more frequent, making them more intense. You're also seeing heat sooner in the summer, and we're also seeing it linger longer. But the reason why taking into account these local differences is so important is because there is a margin of temperatures, where we can make a difference. A lot of climate news, a lot of climate information is very doomsday. I think the reason why we're much more familiar with thinking of people sadly being under threat of hurricanes and wildfires is because these are these big public huge phenomena that we're looking at. Heat is often called, the silent killer. It's not something that we see, right in front of our face that arrests our attention. But the reason that I say there's something promising in there is just like climate change is going to impact our world for the next 30 years. On the local level, we can actually really shrink that timescale. What I mean is that what we do or what we don't do to dampen temperatures by adding, more vegetation or other interventions, what we do to dampen temperatures or what we do to amplify them. Are we introducing, more and more industrial areas? Those decisions, and how those play out, those have immediate consequences. So the promising thing is that whereas, whatever we try to do to try to reverse, some of the worst impacts of the climate crisis, in some ways that won't play out, for decades. But when it comes to urban heat, it's possible to make an immediate difference.
What are some of the solutions to this?
We've talked about parks, of course. There's also, interesting technical innovations, some of which, are more simple than people might guess. Researchers found that painting roofs white reflecting the sun rays rather than sort of absorbing and radiating heat, actually made more of a difference than introducing trees, which isn't to say you have to choose between one another. It's also important to just not limit the conversation, but it's important to take, certain technical innovations and evidence to heart. Because another thing, promoting green roofs. And when I talked to a climatologist about that, what I learned is that it really depends because environmental science is complicated. It actually could do things like, if we had a bunch of green roofs in the wrong place, it could even do things like shorten the lake breeze inland. It could reduce air circulation that takes pollution up and out, from the ground. And so it's really important to get in there on the specifics of what works, in a particular hotspot. The other thing that researchers pointed out is that it also is very important. The other part of that equation is what do the people that live there want? What are they saying about what would make the heat exposure that they experience easier?
Exactly. And I'm thinking about like the local ordinance that means buildings have to provide more air conditioning at an early time for residents. I'm thinking more cooling centers in neighborhoods. You also talked about which neighborhoods have like transportation hubs or shields where people can sit out waiting for public transit versus just being exposed to the heat.
And we found large swaths of the city, of the city's sort of most vulnerable communities don't have access to cooling centers. The researchers that I worked with, they defined access as walking distance within a half mile. Honestly, from reporting that I did last summer and, involving air conditioning protections, one of the people I spoke to, was a senior who didn't live in senior housing because the new amendment has an additional protection for people who live in senior housing, but not all seniors live in senior housing. He also didn't live too far from a cooling center, but it was not reasonable for him to get there. So this definition of access, is important, and it's informed by climate health researchers.
I mean, when we have these talks about climate change, I feel like we know that the city of Chicago, the federal government have to make an initiative, and it won't be as simple as the little things you and I do to make a difference. But what are some of those things that you and I can do on an individual level? Because I'm not going to paint the roof of this apartment building, right? I don't necessarily have access to plant trees up and down 51st Street. So what's something I can do to just maybe engage this conversation?
I think it's a great question. First, I would like to share an anecdote, which is just that whenever I started this story, I was staying in Chinatown, an apartment building where there was no front yard, there was no side yard, there was no backyard. It was entirely asphalt. And, the neighbors below me, not seeking to sort of introduce a climate intervention, but they planted a garden. They were growing squash. I think people who've been around Bridgeport and Chinatown may have seen these hanging gardens, very sort of a rigged situation, like like laundry lines, hanging above what was just an asphalt front yard. I think just having a connection to nature, having a connection, to vegetation and to land, I think that those impulses, those interests, are also just worth pausing and considering. And then as far as, the gist of your question around, what people can do, people could look out for vulnerable members of their community, no matter where they live. So it could be the case that in the hottest parts of the city, people might want to talk with their neighbors about a vacant lot, and perhaps that means bringing conversation to their local officials, to their aldermen. And so even if you're just an individual who cares, the city of Chicago does have a 311 service in which you can request a well-being check.
Sarah, you have given us so much to think about and so much to work on moving forward. I appreciate you taking time to stop by CityCast Chicago today.
I so appreciate being on and the environmental justice reporting that you all have been doing. So thanks so much for having me.
Now, last summer, the city of Chicago enlisted volunteers to create their own map of heat disparities across neighborhoods. They released the results of that effort in December, and the maps look similar to what the Tribune found. The public health and environment departments have said they're using the data to develop tools to more accurately monitor heat differences across neighborhoods and help healthcare and emergency service providers manage heat-related risks. You can find the link to the city's report and the Tribune's original investigation in the show notes. Of course, some good news. The Crosstown Classic kicks off tomorrow and Wednesday night. This first face-off between the Sox and the Cubs will take place in Wrigley. And while the Cubs are playing around .500 baseball and the Sox are, almost 30 games under .500 baseball, the city still usually pulls up for the rivalry game, so I'm excited to see what goes down. As always, we appreciate you for listening and reading. We're going to be back bright and early tomorrow. We'll talk to you then. Peace.